Okay, as promised, this is how European settlement happened in New England, Part 2, specifically about the Massachusetts Bay Colony located right here. Now, remember, the original settlers of New England had been the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were Puritans who wanted to purify the Church of England of Roman Catholic practices, and when it didn't happen quickly enough, they separated themselves from the Church of England. Now, Massachusetts Bay, when the Pilgrims set up the Plymouth colony, they did so and maintained their Puritan lifestyle. The Massachusetts Bay colony was founded by Puritans as well, but they were Puritans who were a little more moderate, not quite as conservative. And they were also non-separatist. They had not left the Church of England entirely. They did want to purify, and again, we're talking about those who founded Massachusetts Bay. They wanted to purify the Church of England of Catholic practices, but they didn't separate themselves from it, at least not initially. Okay, so we know that the Pilgrims were Puritan separatists who had gotten to New England first. But this other group of non-separatist English Puritans eventually made their way to the New World in 1629, 9 years after the Pilgrims had already landed at Plymouth. With Boston as their main settlement, these non-separatist English Puritans founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, again in 1629. Now, they didn't really want to separate from the Church of England, but they did start to fear persecution after a while from King James I, so they decided maybe they'd better leave too. Now, one of the biggest differences between the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony that had come before it was that Massachusetts Bay was extremely well supplied. The first voyage brought over 1,000 immigrants on 11 ships, and eventually, after forming the colony in 1629, they would get another 20,000 more people moving into Massachusetts Bay because of the great Protestant migration of the 1630s. By then, numerous groups, Protestant groups, were afraid of religious persecution in Europe and decided they wanted to leave. Again, that would bring 20,000 more people to Massachusetts Bay. Massachusetts Bay would eventually become New England's biggest and most influential colony, with industries in shipbuilding, fishing. They would also have a pretty expansive fur trade, as well as a lot of other economic areas that they would be very prolific in. Now, while William Bradford is probably the best leader that the Pilgrims had ever seen, in Massachusetts Bay, that honor goes to Governor John Winthrop, who was the governor of Massachusetts Bay for 19 years. His most famous proclamation was that Massachusetts Bay would be a Puritan city on a hill that all other societies could look up to for guidance, as they were the role models for all of those around them of how proper Puritan living should be. Winthrop in Massachusetts Bay also started the first ever Congregational Church, which is something we still have all over the United States today. The Congregational Church extended the vote to all adult males who were, if you remember Calvin's ideas, the visible saints, or the predestined elect to go to heaven. The visible saints in the church got the right to vote. They also gave us a governing method known as the town hall meeting. Most congregational churches, while they were churches on Sundays, would be meeting halls for governing business the rest of the week. However, while this is all good, let's be very clear about one thing here. Massachusetts Bay was not a democracy. Remember, the vote was only being extended to all adult males who were the visible saints, and that was only 40% of the population. Winthrop himself made it very clear that he distrusted the common people, the commons, and the meaner sort of society. He felt like only the predestined elect should be the ones making the decisions. Religious leaders, therefore, had tremendous power and influence. However, a congregation still had the right to fire a minister anytime they wanted to and set his salary. Also, ministers could not hold political office. The rough origins of the separation of the church and state in America actually begin in the governing practices of Massachusetts Bay. And one of the more uniquely famous aspects of the Puritan lifestyle was the Puritan work ethic, as it were. The Puritan work ethic was a serious commitment to work. The Bible often talked about the good of work and how it pleased God. But the Bible also talked about the gift of rest. And therefore, Puritans felt the Bible encouraged them to work very hard, but also to enjoy the simple pleasures of life as well. When it was time to work, you were very serious about it, and you worked hard. But it was time to play. Puritans were known for their enjoyment of beer. They were also, in a very odd twist, I had to read something for a college class once called The Puritans and Sex. That was way more than I needed to know. In any event, they enjoyed the good of work and the gift of rest and the simple pleasures of life. And they passed laws to keep those pleasures very simple. To the Puritans, the work and joys of life were serious business, as was damnation, and they felt you should do both things, the good of work and the gift of rest, in a way that would be pleasing to God. Now remember, though, even with all the Puritan stipulations, Massachusetts Bay was still considered to be a little more accommodating than the Plymouth colony had been, and therefore a lot of ideas came into Massachusetts Bay that probably never would have even arisen in the Plymouth colony. One of those people was Anne Hutchinson, who brought about these ideas. Anne Hutchinson was very intelligent, very strong-willed, and very talkative. The problem that some of the elect in Massachusetts Bay had with Anne Hutchinson is that she said salvation did not depend on following God's or man's law, for that matter even. She also said that God had told her that. Now, as you can imagine, the men of the colony, particularly the elect, had a major problem with this, and soon Anne Hutchinson was banished from the Massachusetts Bay colony, eventually moving to Rhode Island in 1638. Unfortunately for Anne, she would eventually move to New York, and it was there that Native American attacks killed her and her entire family. When word of that got back to Massachusetts Bay, some of the elect said that it was God's plan at work. But backing up for a second, why did Anne Hutchinson leave Massachusetts Bay and specifically go to Rhode Island as opposed to some of the other colonies and settlements that were forming around it? Well, the answer lies in the philosophy of the man who founded Rhode Island in the first place. His name was Roger Williams, and while Rhode Island had been somewhat of a settlement as early as 1635, Williams is given credit for actually establishing Rhode Island as a prominent settlement with the founding of the city of Providence in 1636. Providence defined being the foreseeing care and guidance of God over the creatures of the earth. Roger Williams believed in God and basically said that this is a place where God will provide for us and oversee us and take care of us. Now, the whole reason Williams ended up there in the first place was the Massachusetts Bay colony had banished him. Once he got there, just because of the ideas he was talking about, mostly about religious freedom. Practice any religion that you want to. The people of Massachusetts Bay didn't like that. They had their own ideas based in Calvinism, and therefore banished Williams to go anywhere else that he wanted to, but get out of Massachusetts Bay. Well, when he got to Rhode Island, he built the first Baptist church in America and allowed total religious freedom there as well. You can believe whatever you want to in Rhode Island, and religious freedom is still part of the motto of their state. It's even on the front of their state capitol building. Now, this idea of religious freedom appealed to, obviously, Roger Williams, and it also appealed to Anne Hutchinson and many other people who moved into the region as well. Rhode Island quickly became known as the most liberal colony that was around, populated by many who fled Massachusetts Bay because they thought it was too strict up there. As a result, the people of Rhode Island were pretty happy, but the people in Massachusetts Bay had a name for Rhode Island. They simply referred to it as the sewer of the Lord's debris. Now, in terms of the rest of New England settlement, well, it's not that hard to understand. Let's start over here with Connecticut. Connecticut was founded by the Dutch and the English in 1635 with the settlement of Hartford. Also, in 1638, they created the settlement of New Haven. It was also in 1639 that they came up with, and this is pretty critical to understand, even though we're going through this kind of fast. Underline this in your outline, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. Now, we had the Mayflower Compact, which was really the first governing document in the New World, but the first modern constitution done in that style was the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. When we would create our own constitution for the United States over 100 years later, we would often refer back to the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut as a model. Now, take a look at Maine up here. Maine was actually a part of Massachusetts for years and years and years. Maine was founded in 1623. Now, it eventually joined the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1677 before actually becoming independent again eventually. New Hampshire, if you take a look here, well, you'll notice that something is missing. Today, this is divided up into New Hampshire and Vermont, but back then it was just New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire joined the Bay Colony in 1641, but then became its own colony in 1679. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the settlement of New England. Thanks for listening.